Hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you have joined me here today. Today we are looking at the first half of Nehemiah chapter 2 and the second half of Nehemiah chapter 2 we'll study in a different video. So grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm get it out to more people. So Nehemiah chapter 2, it begins with a timestamp. Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 1 says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. So it's easy to pass by this as a quick reference to a date, but this is extremely important for two reasons. The first reason is that it's been 4 months since Nehemiah heard this disturbing report from his brother Hanani about the state of Jerusalem. Nehemiah has to wait 4 months before God gave him the opportunity to discuss his concerns with the king. So Nehemiah had to wait for God's timing and not force his timing. So waiting on God is never a waste of time. It's actually an investment, and we need to learn to wait patiently because God's timing is never late. Nehemiah trusted God with his timing to the answer of all of his worries. And while we're waiting for God's timing, we need to keep trusting him. Nehemiah trusted God, and while he waited, he planned what was needed to rebuild the walls. Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. So the second reason why this timestamp is really important is that it refers to a particular date. And the reason why it's a bit more complex, and I probably won't explain it very clearly, but feel free to investigate this for yourself because there's a lot of commentators out there that will explain it better than I can. So this first establishes a date given to restore Jerusalem and its walls. And now the prophet Daniel, who lived and died about 200 years before Nehemiah, uses this particular event as a starting point of his prophecy for the coming of Jesus Christ. Daniel prophesies a date that when Jesus Christ, or he refers to him as being the anointed one, is to come. So we need to add Daniel's prophecy from Daniel 9 verse 25 to Nehemiah's plan to rebuild the temple in Nehemiah 2 verse 1 to calculate the time when Jesus is going to come. So Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 verse 25 says, know and understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So Daniel prophesies that Jesus, the anointed one, will come after 7 weeks and 62 weeks of years, which equates to about 483 years from when the plan to rebuild the temple began. So this decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem is found in Nehemiah, and it's the starting point for Daniel's prophecy. So the prophetic clock starts ticking from this date in March 445 BC. So this is when Nehemiah gets this call to rebuild the walls. And it seems like an easy calculation. You just add 483 years and then you get to the date of when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem. But that's not really the case. The ancient Hebrew year consisted of 360 days instead of what we use now, which is 365 days. So there's a lot of figuring out that needs to be done. And thankfully, Sir Robert Anderson did the painstaking work of counting up all the days and making all the calculations for me. The date in April 6, 32 AD, and that's the day that Jesus had ridden into Jerusalem on a donkey. So literally fulfilling the prophecy to that very day. And so Jesus and Jesus alone is the Messiah. And this highlights the unity of the word and the validity of prophecy. So verse 2, Nehemiah 2 verse 2 says, the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. So on this particular day, Nehemiah reports that he had never, ever been sad or depressed in the presence of the king. And on this day, the king actually took notice. Nehemiah became dreadfully afraid. As was the case in the courts in ancient times, it was really kind of forbidden to be sad in the presence of the king. And the idea was that the king was such a wonderful person that merely being in his presence was supposed to make you forget all your problems. So when Nehemiah looked sad, it would be as if it was a terrible insult to the king. So getting back to verse 1, we still haven't really finished that one yet, because we need to really look back to the previous chapter when we see that Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. So when it says that the king asked me, we've got to remember that Nehemiah was right next to the king. So the king asks him, why are you feeling sad? And on the surface, the king's inquiry seems like a very sensitive question on the part of the king. He notices that Nehemiah's sadness and he asks about it. Maybe it was to be sensitive, but we need to understand the power of the king. He could have just had Nehemiah executed right on the spot. He could have said, I don't want this sadness in my throne room, off with your head. That was a possibility that Nehemiah really had to be prepared for. But in addition, Nehemiah's answer might not please the king. It was a geopolitical situation in Judah that Nehemiah was upset about, and something that the king was ultimately responsible for. The king might see this as criticizing his own policies, and maybe off with his head. In fact, the fact that Nehemiah was afraid, it sort of says he was very much afraid, it tells us a great deal about the dynamics of the situation in that throne room. One misspoken word from Nehemiah, and he might not walk out from there. Nehemiah could have been afraid because it was not what you would expect. You wouldn't expect to be sad around the king. And the idea is that you should be happy because you're in the presence of the king. And so your personal concerns shouldn't matter how you feel because you're honouring the king because you're in his presence. And if you are letting your sad emotions get the better of you, it could be an insult to royalty. Verse 3, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look so sad when the city where my ancestors were buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said to me, what is it that you want? And then I prayed to the God of heaven. I answered the king, and if it pleases the king, if your servant has found favour in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. So the king, he asks Nehemiah why he looks so sad. Nehemiah wisely responds, respecting the king's position. He makes reference to the city of where his ancestors have been buried, and it's now in ruins. And Nehemiah may have chosen to include this because Persians, in the culture of the day, the Persian burial rituals, they offered great respect to their deceased ancestors. So he was sort of appealing to the king in the culture of the king. The second half of verse 4 says, then I prayed to the God of heaven. And again, we see Nehemiah pray. He really was a man of prayer. And this prayer is not recorded, and it is presumed to be quite a quick prayer, much different to the longer prayers that have been previously recorded in chapter 1. And it had to be a quick prayer because the king would not have approved of Nehemiah, taking some time out of court to go pray and then take his time to come back to respond to the king's inquiries. If that had been the case, the king perhaps could have suspected treason and refrained from positively responding to Nehemiah. So it's largely agreed that Nehemiah's prayer was just a really quick prayer for help from the Lord. And it's worth remembering that we cannot build a good relationship with God on quick prayers. Quick prayers only work if we have a healthy prayer life filled with long prayers beforehand. So after offering a brief prayer, Nehemiah makes a bold request. He asks for the reigning monarch to authorise the resumption of a project that had previously been halted by royal decree by a previous king. So Ezra had initiated the reconstruction of the walls roughly about a decade earlier, but the previous king, Artaxerxes, subsequently ordered the work of that project to cease. So the Persian law and the politics meant that previous laws couldn't be removed or revoked. So remember that story of Esther? It happened there as well. A king's decree could not be undone. Nehemiah was asking the king to change a previous foreign policy. So Nehemiah was pretty audacious in suggesting that the king disobey a civil law, that the governor in his position as king had made these rulings before him and should never be undone according to Persian culture at the time. So the king, verse 6, then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" And it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. So immediately the king would presume that Nehemiah wasn't just taking the weekend off. This would be a project that lasted many years and perhaps even decades. And so Nehemiah was actually free to return to Judah because of the decree given by King Cyrus. King Cyrus allowed all the Jews and all the exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. But the king valued Nehemiah and he trusted him and he wanted him to continue to be his servant and to return back to him. So what a bold request that Nehemiah made of the king. It says, if it pleases the king to send me. And then he did say, it did please the king to send me. And it seems as if God had stirred the heart of the king. And we see this in Proverbs 21 verse 1. The Lord considers the heart is the section title. And it says, the king's heart is in the hands of the Lord. Like the rivers and the water, he turns it wherever he wishes. So we see that God had turned the heart of the king in favour toward Nehemiah. Verse 7, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah, and that I may have a letter from Asaph, keeper of the royal park, and he will give me timber to make beams and gates for the citadels and the temples, for the city wall, and for the residence that I will occupy. And because of the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my requests. And so I went to the governor of the Trans-Euphrates and gave him the king's letter. And the king had also sent army officers and a cavalry with me. So Nehemiah's request really was extremely audacious. More than just asking the king for time off, Nehemiah then requests letters of reference to the surrounding region, stating that he had the protection of the king and so that he could then pass safely through their lands. But more so than that, he asks for resources, timbers from the king's forest for the gates that had previously been burnt down and for the walls. And more so, he asks for resources for his own house. The first impression appears to be a little bit greedy and sort of self-seeking, but from a project manager's point of view, this is actually a very sensible and really an essential request. As a leader of a large project, he needs a suitable home. And there is no suitable homes in Jerusalem at the time because the city really was just a pile of rubble. So Nehemiah didn't ask because he wanted to take advantage of the king. Instead, it showed honour and respect to the king by inviting him to participate in this worthy work. He knew the king was able to provide these things, and he sensed that the king's heart was willing. So he showed him how the king can do it and what he was willing to do. In verse 8, it says, because the gracious hand of the Lord was on me, the king granted my request. And we see this statement by Paul, really, 500 years later, and it relates how God works in this situation. So in Ephesians 3 verse 20, it says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we can ask or think, according to his power that works in us. And though this is a pagan king, Nehemiah still understood that God could work through him in mighty ways, and God can provide for our needs in totally unexpected ways. So this is all I have for you from the first part of Nehemiah chapter 2. We will continue the second part of chapter 2 in our next study. It has been a pleasure spending time with you, and I look forward to seeing you next time when we finish off chapter 2. Bye.